At Oregon Humanities, we share stories, facilitate conversations, and support partnerships that demonstrate and deepen connections among neighbors. We bring people together to talk about justice, mental health, the environment, aging, power, labor, belonging, and other essential and difficult topics. Whether you participate in a community conversation, read our magazine, attend a training or workshop, or listen to this podcast, you're doing your part to reach across the street or across the state, and you're deepening the well of curiosity, conversation, and understanding. Your financial support of Oregon Humanities helps Oregonians explore challenging questions, learn from different perspectives, and reflect on our own beliefs as we foster a more inclusive, civically engaged, and democratic culture. Visit OregonHumanities.org to donate now, or find us in the Willamette Week Give Guide through December 31st. Thank you. Hello and welcome to The Detour from Oregon Humanities. Let's say, for a moment, that you were looking around, hoping to find justice. Where would you go to find it? Some people, ancient Greek philosophical people, for example, might look to find justice in one person's soul, or if that soul happens to be too hard to see, they might look for it in an imaginary city. Other people might look to find justice in holy books or in the gods those books revolve around. And some of us might try to find justice in the decisions and conduct of people who are actually called justices. That is, we might try to find justice in the people who sit on the highest court of our nation's justice system. How could it not make sense to look there, to look to the Supreme Court, for justice, both to understand it and to see it in action? Today's episode of The Detour brings you a conversation with Dahlia Lithwick, who has reported on, written about, and devoted much of her life to understanding the United States Supreme Court and the justice system more generally. Dahlia is deeply knowledgeable about the culture of the court and the character of its rulings, and she's deeply attuned to the relationship between justice and democracy. And she's quick and funny, too, which seems important when you're talking about something as heavy as justice, especially because justice is so often invoked, demanded, and yearned for in the breach. We talked with Dahlia at the Alberta Rose Theatre in Northeast Portland in September of 2024 to kick off Oregon Humanities' Consider This series on the theme, the people and the public. As you'll hear, Dahlia has a lot to say about the court's relationship with the public and about the public's relationship with the court. She also has a lot to say about the relationship between how the court operates and how we do or don't live toward the democracy that we hope for. Here's Dahlia now, recounting a powerful experience of injustice that she had as a child.
My mother says that she knew I was going to be a lawyer when I was about 10 years old, and she gave me a clothing budget. And she said, this is the amount of money you can spend on your clothes this year, and you can decide how to do it, but this is how it's going to go. And I was enraged. I was just like, I have two brothers. They can wear crappy clothes. I have to wear good clothes. I'm a girl. Clothes are important. Everybody is going to, I created this, manifesto, pages of furious, urging her to rethink. I thought I just deserved all the clothes all the time. And no, but it's awful. It was awful because I was a monster. And to this day, my mother is like, you were scary. You were a scary, scary little girl.
So, I just want to say, it's interesting that thinking of an instance of injustice and you're thinking about anger, rage, and being scary. That's interesting for starters.
Yeah.
And it makes me want to ask the other side of that. Can you think of a time as a kid when you thought, this is justice. I know what this feels like.
Wow, these are really hard. Are they going to get harder?
It's just going up.
Because I am going to order a drink.
Well, there are plenty of people who would bring you a drink if you want one. So for real. But no, they won't. They'll get a little harder. But justice.
Let me think. Justice as a child. I think this is just going to be incredibly unfair, but my big brother was kind of a thug, and he just was extremely. He just was like called me names. I'm just going to tell you. He used to call me Dahlia for a really long time, right? Mean. See, these are just like the things that drive you to law school. And I think probably when the times when, on the very rare times when I think my parents were like, yeah, that really, really like is not just normal sibling behavior. That is like beyond sibling behavior and would discipline him. I think I would feel like, there's people in the sky who are imposing justice in a way that makes the world make sense. And I think, when I think about, I know this isn't your question, but I think about the way we have gone wrong in this country, my answers kind of dovetail with both of those things. I think just with respect to the clothing allowance story, the ethos of scarcity in this country, that other people have stuff and I don't, which infects every single part of, I think, how the Supreme Court thinks about justice right now, right? Your kid goes to Harvard, my kid can't go to Harvard, then like we must have a problem, right? If those people can't adopt Native American children from tribes and like the Native American tribes get them, that's not fair to those people, right? It's this constant grinding ethos of anytime anyone gets anything in America and you lose, that's injustice. It's like a very childlike view of it. And then just the flip of that, like when you feel like you get justice, which is what, like when Sky Daddy tells you you're right, that's like both of those things are totally childlike views of justice that I feel like have completely infused the way we think about law and justice in this country.
Great. That actually feels right on, and it feels like a helpful way to start thinking about, what you said about the sort of people in the sky that are going to do the right thing where justice is concerned. And maybe one more. This is not a childhood question. It's as we move towards the question of law and the courts. And I guess I wonder if you could talk about how it is that you decided or came to sort of start paying attention to the Supreme Court specifically. Why was that the thing that you were like, this is where I'm going to put my attention?
So this is a funny story because I went to law school. I probably couldn't have named, other than Sandra Day O'Connor, who was at the time, when I applied to law school, the only woman on the Supreme Court. I don't think I could have named 4 justices. I just didn't think about the court very much. I went to law school because after college, between college and law school, I worked at Paul Newman, had a camp. At the time, it was only one camp. Now it's a whole network of camps for kids with terminal illnesses and cancers and blood diseases. And I worked at the camp for a couple of years between college and law school and wrote a book about it. And what I realized was that every single kid that I worked with at the camp would have been better served if they had a lawyer than a doctor. They were navigating health insurance, they were all of them navigating a just complete Byzantine system that made it impossible for their families to, both give them health access and eat and take care of them and have jobs. And I realized really quickly, every single one of those kids needed a lawyer. And which ironically, Becca Heller, one of the chapters in my book, describes, right, when she starts working with migrants, how every single one of those people needed a lawyer. So it was not like, oh, I want to be an attorney and, do constitutional law, and I'm so obsessed with Anthony Kennedy. Like, that is not what drove me. I would have been the one person obsessed with Anthony Kennedy. But that was not what drove me to law school. What drove me to law school, and this is your injustice point, was the sense that how is it possible that we live in a country where people who hit absolute rock bottom in the luck Olympics, and then what they need is a lawyer to fight for them, and none of them have access to a lawyer. So I didn't even start to really think about the U.S. Supreme Court quite literally until I had worked at Slate for a few weeks. This is a ridiculous story, but I worked at Slate as a freelancer. I covered the Microsoft trial, and then they called me and said, do you want to keep covering the court because you're funny? And I was like, okay. And then I like staggered into the Supreme Court building, and I was like, every one of these men looks exactly the same. I mean, they all, Souter looks like Breyer looks like Kennedy. Oh, Clarence Thomas, okay, and Scalia. But like, it was so crazy. I knew nothing about it, and then I'll stop rambling. But like, the funniest part about the Supreme Court press corps, which nobody tells you, is that they march you in order of importance in the world. There is no other like press corps in the world where you come to cover the argument, and they're like, the seats are like, the rows are like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, 1 to 12, 1 to 12, 1 to 12, and they're like, you are C8. I think C8 was where I peaked. I never got higher than C8. Linda Greenhouse is A1. Dina Totenberg is A1. Linda Greenhouse is A2. And then they make you line up in the hall and march in that order, so that like all the B's are like, ha ha, C's, suck it, C's, and the D's are mad at it was insane. And you walk in like the Medici wedding, right? Where you're like, I am the 17th most important person in the room. And the reason I tell this story is because only the A's and the B's can see. Everybody else is sitting behind these columns and curtains. And so this is the press corps, right? These are the people who are tasked with explaining the court to the public, and they can't see. So the way you know who's speaking at oral argument, right? Obviously there's no television, is that somebody from the press office at the court is flashing hand signals. They're like, Scalia, 4, and the 4 corresponds to their rank, right? So then like you're like trying to figure out, and you're looking at your notes, and you're like, okay, who's that? Well, it's not Clarence Thomas, he doesn't talk. Okay, it's, but you're trying to figure out who's talking, and I couldn't do voice recognition because I had no idea who these people were.
So
I don't know what that story was even about.
Well, I think it's about a lot, and it's interesting where you were talking about the kids who needed the help of a lawyer, and then talking about the entrenched hierarchy even among the press corps and the opaque character of the court. And it seems to me these things are related, and I think it's probably where we're going to go. And so I guess I want to ask about that here early on, this question of, it seems like from reading the book, from listening to Amicus, from listening to other things, you've had both very strong positive feelings. You're drawn towards the court as a tool for improving our democracy, and increasingly skeptical about how it could do that. But the thing I want to ask about, based on what you just said about how you got lined up and marched in, is that the court of the 3 branches seems to be the most hierarchical, the least accessible. And so just want to ask about that. Like, what's the relation between our hopes for democracy from the court and the way it functions in this hierarchical, mostly opaque manner?
That is the question, Adam, and I think the answer, there's so many layers. I mean, you could go, beyond hierarchical, and you can go beyond self-mystifying, like there's all that, and then there's just anti-democratic, and like there's it's all the way down. I guess, my first cut at the answer is that the court is in this kind of unique position, right? And this is by design. You can, read the Federalist Papers. This was by design, right? It has neither the power of the purse nor the sword. The only power it has is public legitimacy. And the idea was meant to be that the court would earn that public, forbearance and acceptance and tolerance. And that doesn't happen immediately, right? It takes many generations. Justice Breyer talks about this in all of his books, but, it took really a long time for that kind of capital to build, where the American public said, okay, the court, even though it has no army, even though it has no treasury, even though the American people could just vote to like turn off all the lights and, take out the toilets, the court is the decider. And that is very improbable. And that was the experiment. And I think that the choice was made, and this is why your structural questions, beyond just the large D democracy questions, are good ones, is that part of the way the court decided to do that was through this process of mystification, right? They built, it took until the 1930s, but they built a building that looks like a temple, right? It doesn't look like other government buildings. It looks like the Oracle at Delphi. That's by design. The black robes, by design. For many, 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 many years, most of the court's history, if you got a transcript of an oral argument, it didn't say, like if you look up the transcript for Brown v. Board, it doesn't say which justice is asking the questions. It just says the court. Because the presumption was they're all these 9 perfect brains in a vat, and you don't need to know, which justice was asking the question. It took years until they realized that, maybe people want to know whether it was, Justice Stewart or Justice Brennan asking a question. But I think it's part of when we who cover the court would say things like, and I don't want to go deep in the weeds with my complaints about how they made it hard to cover the court, including, in June when you don't know which decisions are coming down, you don't know which days are decision days, you can't possibly, you literally sit there waiting for the jack in the box to, kind of leap out and punch you in the neck. And we call that June. But, it's such a crazy system, and no other court in the world is it's sort of mystified to the degree that the Supreme Court is, and up to and including not having audio for the longest time, right? We had to fight to get same-day audio. The secret reason that Amicus drops on Saturday morning, which is a kind of sort of improbable time for a podcast to drop, was because for years and years and years, all of the audio archives would go straight to the Library of Congress. You couldn't get audio at all. And then at some point, then Chief Justice Rehnquist was saying, we're going to do audio for Bush v. Gore and the gun cases and the abortion cases and affirmative action, right? You'd get 4 or 5 same-day audios a term. And people like me on the press corps wrote stupid articles saying, you can't pick and choose which are the 5 important cases of the term. If you're the named plaintiff in something that isn't the affirmative action case, you sure think your case is important. And more pointedly, and I did write this at the time, why would you signal to the American public that the cases that are most divisive and ideological and polemical, where the justices are most apt to act out, those are the important ones? Don't you want to just do the maritime law cases and have everyone be like, oh, what they do is so boring, but at least they're unanimous? That seems like a good message. And after I wrote that piece, I got word back, from somebody saying, the Chief Justice read your piece and he just wants you to know we could take all the audio away. And, right? Nice press corps you got there. Would be a shame if something happened to it. So when that's a true story. A couple years later, there was immense pressure on then Chief Justice Roberts. So they took all the audio away, and then there was pressure on Chief Justice Roberts to give there's arguments for not having a camera in there. There is no argument for not having same-day audio. And we know that when you can hear it, people were sitting in their cars and listening. And so what did the Chief Justice do? His grand bargain was they would drop all the audio for the week on Friday at 6 o'clock at night, when every journalist except Nina Totenberg is drunk in a bar. And so it was the best possible way to be look at how transparent, we are, and also give us something we couldn't work with. And we just made Amicus a Saturday morning show for no other reason than the subversive plan to get oral argument in people's ears. So I think that it's a huge, long-winded way of saying that I think the error, and we're really seeing it now with the leaks, the error the court has made is the choice to sort of less and less and less transparency, more and more and more blame the messenger, right? Get mad at the press corps, get mad at critics. And there's this sense that a public legitimacy is not something that the public confers on them, but something they have conferred on themselves. And when it's threatened, they come out like hot and crazy. And so I think the answer is we are really now, I think, living in kind of the detritus of a really bad set of plans about we'll hide everything, we won't file financial disclosures, we'll go on super yachts, we'll do all this stuff, and nobody will find out. And then when people find out, the answer now is you're delegitimizing the court.
Mm-hmm. So there's so much in that comment, including what you said a couple minutes ago that it used to be that opinions were just attributed to the court.
Not opinions, questions in oral argument.
Questions, I apologize,
Yeah.
Thank you. And now they're attributed to the individuals, and I can see arguments, at least in principle, that it would be better if it were not attributed to individuals. In a way, we're so aware of the individuals on the court that the court seems to have disappeared behind the individuals. So I want to ask you about that. How did that happen, that we're so aware of the individuals that we've sort of lost sight of the court? And is that a good thing, that we've seen the individuals come more into our sight?
I mean, I think you're exactly right. And I think most court watchers attribute this phenomenon to two things. One is the just celebrification of everybody, right? And so, Sonia Sotomayor is throwing out the first pitch at ball games, right? And Justice Ginsburg is a rapper icon. And this is not the way I came up, right? For those of you who are old enough to remember, after the book The Brethren came out, which was really like a, peel it all out, throw it on the ground, and let people see how the sausage is made, that was such a catastrophe for the court that really after The Brethren came out, the court sort of locked down on nobody's giving public speeches, nobody's doing appearances, nobody is talking to the press. The law clerks, most of the time that I was covering the court, the law clerks, if they spoke to you, it was at their peril. It was understood if somebody leaked, if a clerk leaked anything, they will never work in Washington again, right, with the $500,000 signing bonus that comes with that. So honest to God, when I first started covering the court, I had a very good friend who was clerking, and when she would meet me for lunch, she would wear a hat and dark glasses and almost the fake mustache, terrified of talking to the press, and that really held. So I think part of what happened is somewhere in the mid-90s, and I remember Justice Scalia naming this, he said, we've all been super quiet, we never talk, we don't do public events, we don't go on TV, and then he used the word, I think it's time for us to come out of the closet, is what he famously said, which I think that those words don't mean what you think they mean. But he really felt like if everybody was talking about the court, he needed to be in the conversation. And then more and more you would see, right, justices writing books, and justices, going suddenly, Justice Breyer is on wait, don't tell me, and suddenly, all the justices are on TV. So I think there is this celebrity thing that starts, and now it's off the hook, right? Now it's truly the case that the justices are rock stars. When I first started covering the court, there were stories every single year about people handing their camera to Justice David Souter and not knowing he was Souter and being can you take our picture? But, nobody knew who any of the justices were, just the same way I didn't. I think the other thing that happened in addition to this sense, and by the way, this starts to inflect in the doctrine, right, where you see justices writing. And Professor Dean Erwin Chemerinsky has really, I think, salient thoughts on this. They're starting to write sort of sound bites, right? They're starting to write dissents that they know are going to be, turned into a TikTok or turned into a thing, right? So it that sense that what you want to do is sort of do the throwdown line at oral argument starts to ramp up. And then the other piece is just confirmation hearings. I mean, I think we forget, again, that throughout most of history, confirmation hearings happened on paper. It wasn't until, I think Justice Brandeis was the first one who went to his own confirmation hearing, and only because there was rampant anti-Semitism that was going to scupper his confirmation. The first televised confirmation hearing was Sandra Day O'Connor. until then, this was like a 5-minute, yes, no, of course, yes, they're fine. They breathe, they ambulate, they're in. Like there was not, and then suddenly it turns into this sort of like telenovela, 5-day event of like screaming and crying and the wife and the, senators and the gotcha. And I think both of those things, to just go to your question, absolutely delegitimize the court because it makes it a kind of cult of personalities. And I think that the justices, with some exceptions, have kind of let that dictate how, not just how they behave, but as I said, sometimes how they write.
It's interesting to think that impulses toward transparency in some way might end up running against the court's ability to do what it most ought to do. Which it sounds like some of that is happening there. It makes me wonder what we most should hope for from the court. When you said that the justices have become celebrities, in a way they've become celebrities, but they've also very clearly become political pawns, which doesn't feel exactly the same, and so that we almost know what they're going to say before we've read the opinion or the question, because of who says it. And do you have a sense of how or when that shift happened, where like you kind of know?
So a couple of things. One thing, and I actually think this is unbelievably important and we've missed it, is that the confirmation process actually changes the justices, right? And so I wrote about this a lot at the time. If you go back and look at the justices whose views on the First Amendment have become most radically anti-press, anti-public access, anti-openness and transparency, almost one-to-one, perfect, unerring correlation between the justices who had a bad time at their confirmation hearings. And that's not entirely unreasonable because I think we forget that every single justice who has come to the Supreme Court in modern times comes from like what, an obscure circuit court, right? An obscure somewhere in the Justice Department. These are not people who are used to the like Klieg lights of public scrutiny. And so if you look at, Justice Alito, who I really believe to this day is angry about what happened at his confirmation hearings, where you may recall, like he was being called a racist for an eating club he was at, involved with in Princeton. His wife, Martha Ann, left the room crying. I mean, that changed the way he thought about the press and the public. Justice Thomas, don't get me started. When you read Justice Thomas, his concurring opinion in the campaign finance case, he's talking about like public disclosure as though it's like to disclose, your donors is a video game in which, you end up bloody and writhing on the floor. I mean, he really is of the view that public scrutiny of any sort is toxic and dangerous. And case after case after case, there, I think, two of the most extreme iteration of people who just really are mistrustful of the press and the public. And I think that that's not accidentally because they felt that they really, really got raked over the coals, fairly or not, at their hearings. So I think one piece of it is like, I think we should be thinking much harder. And Justice Kavanaugh, I would say the same. But even, it was very, very clear to me that Justice Jackson was really affected by the sort of what was directed at her in the press and by the Senate at her hearing. So we should be asking ourselves, are these job interviews in which, this person is in front of their families, like flayed alive for 5 days? Is it worth doing that if they are going to have a lifetime appointment in which they decide what the press does? Like, I just think we have not been very smart about understanding, and I really mean this. It leaches into their views of the doctrine that if your one experience with the public and the press is that they are merciless, feral monsters who want to destroy your life, that might affect how you write about, the public. So that's one piece of it. And then I think that the other piece of it is that we have just entered a time, and we're so in it that we forget that it really wasn't until like the last 5 or 6 years that every single liberal on the court was appointed by a Democrat, every single conservative on the court was appointed by a Republican. Like, that's new. We've never had that. And so we now have a court where, as you said, it's like, you put in a quarter, you get your Snickers bar. I mean, and that's entirely a construction of, you can sort of pick your poison, whether it's, this multi-million-dollar judge-making factory, right, that, raises young judges like hydroponically underground so that by the time they're like in law school, they're already being groomed, right, for the right clerkship and then the right spot on the right, bench. And then, I mean, this is clearly a juggernaut, and we've never had that. And, if you think back to, could Hugo Black get on the court today? Could Justice Marshall get on the court? I mean, nobody could get on the court under these terms. You literally have to be part of a machine. And so, of course, it's entirely predictable because, and this really goes to, I feel like maybe this is the beating heart of your question, which is we've never, in my lifetime, not had a swing justice. And suddenly, I mean, my friends, the swing justice is Brett Kavanaugh. I mean, last term, I think it became Justice Barrett. But, these are not swing justices the way, you could walk into a case, you had no idea what Justice O'Connor would do. You could predict with about 60% accuracy what Justice Kennedy was going to do. I mean, you can predict. And so I think you're right to say there are no surprises, and I think that's because the entire institution is now captive to kind of financial and political forces that own the building.
Okay.
Womp womp.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wasn't expecting we were going to be skipping around here.
Yeah.
A minute ago, you talked about how it was that the incoming justices came to trust the public less. But I want to ask you about the other side of that. These days, the public does not seem to trust the court. What would it take for the public to come to trust the court? What are things that could change that would decrease our merciless approach to all of this?
Okay, the sad laughter in the back right of the house. I mean, this is where, and this is my bias, I think the court has squandered the public trust. I think that, and here's a place where I've just been wrong, I think that the court has always been in a kind of a dance with public opinion, with the American public. And you asked the structural question before and I didn't answer it. I mean, I think we all understand that the basic theory of, the three branches of government and checks and balances and of lifetime appointments and of insulating the justices from political wins. The theory is we need a counter-majoritarian branch, right? We need a court that is not going to, put up its finger and say, well, the public wants desegregation, let's do it. It's important, it's essential to protecting minorities. So I think we have to be very clear that when the court acts in counter-majoritarian ways, we can't just throw up our hands and say, well, the public doesn't like it, right? We want that, it's baked in. But then I think, just to go to your question, the court seems to now think that what the best way to sort of like show judicial independence is to just not care and to aggressively, I think, sort of fly in the face of public opinion, even on, and we can sort of tick down the things that I think that they could do to change it. But the simple things, like the low-hanging fruit, when the American public is telling you at like 86, 87%, they want an enforceable ethics code because every other judge in the country, every other Article III judge in the country is bound by an ethics code, and it's not like choose your own ending. I think I'm ethical, move on. It's not that. There's no ethics code in the world in which the justices are their own arbiters of whether they've crossed the line. And so to me, like, that seems like the minute that was starting to become an issue, not saying, you're right, America. 230 years later, we probably should be bound by the same ethical rules at minimum that other federal judges. And instead to do this ridiculous song and dance that is like, well, we can't do that because it's a threat to judicial independence, and like we wouldn't, want to take away anyone's super yacht. And, I just think it is so mealy-mouthed and so sort of insensitive to the enormity of the problem. And I just want to point out, I think I wrote this week in response to the amazing piece by Jodi Kantor and Adam Liptak, the reporting on Sunday about, the sort of how the sausage was made in the 3 January 6 cases. I almost think the most interesting piece that didn't get as much attention as it should, is if they are correct that Fisher case, which was, the statute that they were charging the insurrectionists with, and the court said you can't use that statute in that way. And that case was originally assigned to Justice Alito. And at least to hear, the Times speculation, this happens around the same time that the Flaggate 1, Flaggate 2 happen. And the most interesting thing is that this has never happened. Nobody has any memory of somebody losing an opinion, not because they couldn't get 5 votes for it, that happens, but because they did something, right, that the chief apparently pulls the opinion back and writes it himself. And the amazing part of that story is that Justice Roberts knew about the flag stuff years earlier. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the flag stuff that was the problem, it was getting caught that was the problem. And to me, if you needed a still life in the problem at the court, it's that nothing is a problem until you're caught. And then when you're caught, it isn't even like, maybe we shouldn't be flying upside down flags. It's, I'm going to quietly take away the Fisher opinion, presumably, if that's what happened, and maybe nobody will ever know what happened. And I just think that bespeaks a certain contempt for this public engagement with and public concern about the court that worries me almost more than the conduct itself, because if you can't be honest about why you're losing the people, you're going to lose the people.
How much should the court be thinking about the people? I'm asking that in part because we're thinking about the people and the public throughout this series, and in part because the court is deliberately structured to be less responsive to, say, you used the phrase public opinion a couple minutes ago. And I remember, I think it was Rosie Abella, the justice in Canada, who said, our job is to respond to the public interest, not public opinion. And public opinion is so loud now and comes from so many directions. And some of the things we were laughing about before robes, all the things that make it seem to try to protect the court from being too subject to public opinion. So how can the court be responsive to the public interest but not be driven by public opinion?
Okay, I want that martini now. These are. I'm kidding. These are good questions. I think that the court is unlike the political branches insofar as you have to hold two completely irreconcilable ideas in your head all the time. And one is, there's a great book about this, that's like all judges are political except when they're not. And that's literally like the title, because you have to hold in your head that of course it's a political branch. It is by nature a political branch. You're, appointed by the president, you're confirmed by the Senate. It's a political office, and it's something else. It's that tension that I think animates everything you're asking me right now. What do you do with the branch that is political and also doing a different thing? Presumably, we used to think that this other thing was, triangulating against the Constitution or, close reading a statute, whatever it was. There was a second project. And the tension is, how do you live in that? And by the way, I've been incredibly and increasingly critical of the Supreme Court press corps because I think we err way too much on the side of the other thing, that second thing. They're oracles, they're great, we're going to interpret their opinions, we're not going to look at what's behind the curtain. And which is why, by the way, Jodi Kantor at the New York Times, who's an investigative reporter, is breaking these stories, right? It's why ProPublica is breaking these stories. The Supreme Court press corps is still like, in a spirited opinion today, I couldn't see it because I was in D7, but I'm told, this, we're still kind of taking dictation, a lot of us on this beat, and that's like mea culpa. But I think that the tension between the aspiration of doing something that is much bigger than just raw politics, like who you'd pull the lever for if you're voting, and raw politics, that's the work of the court. And I think that what the court has done is, instead of saying we are going to behave in a way that really bolsters and reinforces and reifies that second narrative, that what we do is law and it's different and it doesn't map onto our politics. That's their job. That's not my job. And I think that then, when instead of doing that, right, which is why I would say, have an ethics code. It's why I would say, if you have a conflict of interest, disclose it and don't, right? Those are all behaviors that would bespeak a commitment to that second project. If instead of that, you just say, we're closing all the windows, you can't come in, we're going to just keep lying to you, and you're bad for questioning us, right? That's behavior that goes in that category 1. And so I think that the real kind of tragedy here is that it was theirs to keep or to squander. And I think that and this is really important, this is if nothing else that I said today makes sense, I hope this does. Those of us who are critical of the way the court is conducting itself right now, it's not because we want to have no court. I think we need to be perfectly candid about the fact that whether we like it or not, this court, as currently constituted, will be deciding, I think, this 2024 election. It's not, we don't want this election to be fought out in the streets, right? That's how they do it in other countries. So we need to have a legitimate court, because no constitutional democracy can continue without a legitimate court. And so those of us who are saying, oh my God, do the ethics reform, have term limits, have age limits, the numbers are astounding across ideology that people want, just basic things. We don't have to talk about court packing. Term limits, enforceable rules about disclosure and about recusal, and they do none of it. What they're leaving us with is the double, I think, tragedy of a court that is going to continue to be the court, and an American public that is going to say, yeah, no, this time, no. I did it, in Bush v. Gore, I acceded to your decision, and this time, no. And that will not have been our fault.
So a lot of the changes that you just mentioned that you think the court could be making fairly easily are changes around process. And the chapter in Lady Justice on Me Too, for example, is largely about where is the clear, transparent, accountable process. And what's interesting about that, one of the things that's interesting about that is, I put myself in a group of people who responds madly to the content of the decisions more than the process. That's what drives me in some way to react. And so I think the question I want to ask is about how, especially a lay person, which is the great majority of us who don't know as much as you know, how should we be responding to the decisions that come down from the court? What should we be consulting as part of the public to evaluate whether these are legitimate? Should we be thinking about process, or should we be consulting our conscience and hoping for consistency with that? What is it that most of us that are not schooled in this should do to try to understand how to react?
So I love this question, because I think part of my own answer is, you either believe that something has fundamentally changed on this court in the last few years, or you don't. I believe something has fundamentally changed. We haven't talked about doctrine that much tonight, but, when you have a court that simply doesn't care about precedent, right? Or willy-nilly saying, Chevron was the law, now it's not, Roe was the law, now it's not, whatever it is, the Lemon Test was the law, now it's not. I mean, when there are, and this a little bit goes to your, I think animating question about why justice, mattered to me and still matters to me. I think a huge part of it is predictability, right? Knowing you're going to get the same result time after time. It is what in the law we call reliance, an interest in knowing that you've organized your life around a world that works in a certain way and that it's going to be like that tomorrow, right? There are a bunch of markers for what is a process that gets us to a just decision. It's not feelings ball. I have many, many times covered cases that I would have decided differently, but I didn't say, no, this process is corrupt. But I think when you have a court that is, and there's so many iterations of the problem, whether it's deciding things on the so-called shadow docket, right? Cases that have not been argued, have not been briefed. There's a little back of the napkin 3 sentences that comes out at midnight, SB 8 in Texas. It's cool, right? This is Professor Steve Vladeck, and his book is amazing on this. But there's just marker after marker after marker. Last year, the EMTALA cases, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act cases, where the court reached out, took it, said there was an emergency, there was no emergency, heard arguments, and then said, "Oops, we shouldn't have taken this; it was way too early." Right. So there are these process markers of the court not following its own rules, and whether it's the rule for when you reverse precedent, like there are very clear rules for when you can reverse precedent. We don't care. There's inventing a doctrine. There's a major questions doctrine. What is the major question? I don't know. It's what Justice Gorsuch says it is. And I think that we're just seeing the process breaking. And I think that there's a level of, the feelings ball piece of it, which is I don't like this outcome. And then they're distorting the process to get to the outcome. And I know that sounds like a lawyerly answer, but it is the answer. And I think if you kind of pan back one from there, I would also say the process of even how we seat justices has now become so completely corroded, right? That, you can fight about whether it was a, Ginsburg rule or it was a Merrick Garland rule or whatever the rule was. But we used to seat justices when there were vacancies until we didn't, right? And then we created a rule that said we don't seat justices in an election year, but then we did, right? So I just think that process too has almost entirely broken down. And so when people have this kind of visceral sense, I'm trying to decide if I don't like Dobbs or if I don't like Bruin, the gun case, because I just don't think, we should make abortion illegal, or I don't think, everybody who wants a gun should have one because the framers hadn't invented the machine gun. I think those are kind of gut check questions that you're asking me. And I think separate and apart from that is the question of how did that case get there? Who argued it? Where did the money come from? And I think that this is where, last year I remember saying, we're still largely thinking about, and certainly reporting on the court, as though it's this laboratory, this pristine laboratory of justice, without saying, the laboratory has been bought and owned and peopled with scientists by one side that literally is getting $1.6 billion donations to put people in the lab. And then we are being kind of acculturated to say, fascinating decision, in Loper Bright. And so I think we have to just be committed to the proposition that if we believe that processes matter, how far off this sort of procedural track do we have to be before we say this decision isn't a decision? And
even more than that, it sounds like this court isn't exactly a court. I mean, that's the direction that you used words like corrupted, corroded, broken down, one after the other. And at a certain point, I think I want to check in with my hopes and go, what am I hoping for from this? Would my hopes be better served by pointing them somewhere else? And so want to ask that question with reference to the kind of motion of the book and a couple of the women who you look at there, and Anita Hill, who has probably more reason to move away from the institution of the law and the court than maybe anybody, remains an institutionalist, remains committed to the law. Some of the other people you talk about seem to move from the law towards organizing. And that, in a way, the direction of the latter half of the book is to move out of the court towards organizing. So I want to ask you, as someone who did go sit in row C, with love, it sounds like, institutionalist or looking elsewhere?
So first of all, my favorite, I think we talked about this in the green room, which is not green. We were talking about, my favorite line in the book is like a colloquy with Anita Hill, where I say some version of why you're still working, within the contours of this legal system that was designed and is perpetuating, violence against women of color. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do, and still you're trying to perfect it. And her answer, which I thought, was so eloquent, was there's no plan B. There's no other thing. When the rule of law breaks down, there's chaos, is what she says. And who never, ever thrives in a system of power and chaos is like women of color, right? Like, we will lose if it's fought out on the streets. And so we perfect it because plan B is like the militia, and that's bad. And I think that's really, she doesn't say the militia, she would never say that, I'm saying that. We have to perfect it because we don't have another thing. But you're exactly right. Descriptively, about halfway through drafting the book, I realized that, I like Law and Order too, and I love courtroom scenes, and I could describe, people winning in court every day, which was what the first half of the book was. And I was sort of having the realization that you and I are having on this stage, which is you can win all the court cases in the world and still lose democracy. And, we really saw that, right? We have seen that time and time again, that winning in court, which we have this notion that that's the arc of justice, that gets you halfway. And then the other half is fighting for democracy. And so the rest of the book, there's this moment, like I think Vanita Gupta, who at the time was at the leadership conference and now at the Justice Department. And, she had also won a whole bunch she won this incredible policing misconduct case in Tulia, Texas. She was a lawyer's lawyer, and then suddenly she was at the Justice Department, and then suddenly she was at the leadership conference, and she becomes an organizer. And then, Stacey Abrams and the sort of all the people toward the end of the book are much more involved in sort of organizing and in democracy repair. And Nina Perales, who's doing One Person, One Vote. And I think what I realized is that, just as justice is an aspiration, so is democracy. And we think that those things are, carved in amber, immutable things. They're not. And to the extent anything is carved in amber, it's sort of the injustice that is baked in to a constitutional system, right, that has an electoral college and a malapportioned Senate and, minority presidents who lose the majority of the votes, who are, then picking Supreme Court justices who are then confirmed by Senate that is, much less than half the country, right? We're baked in doing the same things over and over again, and the only way that changes is by organizing and changing democracy. And so then I just became very, very obsessed, and this is sort of the theme of the book, with these people who understand that we just can't win trials. We're going to have to do profound work on, reforming the Electoral Count Act, which we did after the 2020 election. And, state gerrymandering has to be repaired, and state Supreme Courts have to be repaired. Like, all of that work, which, by the way, I know that lights are off, but I know your faces are all like, Because it's so, like, democracy reform, like, no one is ever going to make a Netflix special about, like, reforming the Electoral Count Act. But it's like, this is the stuff of democracy, and it's a dream, and we're not there. And these women who are just, like, never going to get famous, they're never going to get, millions of dollars, they're never going to have a Netflix special made for them. But they are doing this amazing in-the-trenches work that I think is, if we can do it correctly, going to perfect democracy, not just justice, but democracy. And like, I mean, dude, I have goosebumps. Like when I think about that as the job, as opposed to winning trials, which is just like feels really good, but it's not going to get us there.
Mm-hmm. I love that you just said, dude. I think I have a sort of impolite question, and it's related to something that Roberta Kaplan says in the book about why she's drawn to law initially. And it's because she's suddenly surrounded by all these very smart people. And she realizes, like, these are the smartest people she knows. And so I think the impolite question is, why is it so hard for all these smart people who agree to do what's right?
In the context, do what's right in the context of?
Democracy or inclusion. Take any of the big words we're after and whose absence we're lamenting. Why is that so damn hard?
I mean, I think there's a couple of things happening. And this is the slight, like, my producer of my podcast says, you're not even like Eeyore, you're broken Tigger. Like, she's like, Eeyore I could handle, but you're just like, you used to be so bouncy and now you're so sad all the time. And I think one of the things that worries me, and it goes back to our sort of celebrity culture question, is that I really came up, in a time where we were all like, I don't have to do anything because RBG is going to fix everything for everyone. Like, if I just buy, like, the votive candle, the mug, the earrings, the descent collar, watch both movies twice, and, have the throw pillow, like, we're good. Democracy is safe. And I think, and I quote my friend Rebecca Solnit in the book, talking about how we have very much metabolized kind of a culture of, Kamala's going to fix it, or, Trump is going to fix it. Someone's going to fix it. We have to own this and, like, embody it in our day-to-day lives, not just a couple times a year, not just get out the vote, not just buying merch, but really, really say, like, the whole, dream of whether this thing rises or falls isn't like having other smart people do it. It's we have to be the smart people who do it.
Dahlia Lithwick is a renowned legal analyst, journalist, and author known for her coverage of the U.S. Supreme Court and the justice system. She lives in Charlottesville, Virginia. You can find more of Dahlia's work in our show notes at OregonHumanities.org. The Detour is produced by Kieran Bond. Kyle Gilmer is our editor. Ben Waterhouse, Karina Brisky, and Alexandra Sylvester are our assistant producers. This is Adam Davis. See you next time.